Hi, I'm Terri Suresh. Welcome back to the Wellness Curve. I'm here with my guest, Andrea Jones. She is the relationship coach, and she has coined this amazing term called Menglish. How do you understand it? What does that mean? And we'll get to that a little bit later. When I left you before, we were talking about what does it mean to stay a woman and stay feminine and be feminine in a man's world. And how can you keep your happily ever after, find your happily ever after? That's kind of what we're going to cover in this segment. So what makes you and your approach to happily ever after so unique?
Well, I think the biggest difference to me and other women or men in this area is, first of all, I live the life that I want to help others to get. So I am married and I raise kids. You have to be in that situation to be able to do that. It's great if you get out of college and you're young and you want to teach that. However, life is different when you have kids. I have twins too, so I talk a lot to mothers of twins. I've been there, done that. So that's one difference. The other difference, I think, is because I grew up in a different culture, and I look at things a different way. For example, here in the States, when I moved here, Europeans always think Americans are far ahead in everything, whether it's fashion, movies, in everything. And I was kind of shocked when I came here that when it comes to relationships, we're like totally backwards. Right. Yeah, I mean, in relationships, intimacy and being close with each other, that is something that is so not talked about. And kids in school don't have any education early on. Where I remember when I went to school in Europe, we start that education in elementary school. Of
relationship, communicating, those kinds of things?
Yeah, and sexual education also early on. Right. We have that in elementary school. In elementary school, of course, age appropriate, but it's not a topic that is totally taboo. Right. You talk about it, it's normal to see and hear things, and then when you grow up, you have a more clear expectation what's going on, and that's not the case here in the States, I found. It's very different.
So when you're, part of your unique style of teaching it is, number one, you've lived it. You understand it. It's like you said, you can't, come out of college and decide you want to teach gender communication and relationship. You've got a lot of background, obviously, life experience. And then the second thing is your cultural differences. And I know you speak to, I've heard you speak, you do corporate keynote speeches and all kinds of speaking, and it's awesome. But I've heard you speak to cultural differences, and I don't know, maybe you're going to get into that a little bit later, but I've heard you speak to there's cultural differences between men and women too, and does that play some sort of role in this whole happily ever after?
Yes, I mean, when you look at me being from Europe and you being from the States, you do things that are totally normal to you that are not normal to me. For example, Americans ask, how are you? Right. But you don't really care how I am. So
this is so funny because ever since you've told me that, I really pay attention when I ask someone, how are you? I want to really say it with sincerity. This is funny, but I'm sorry to interrupt. Keep saying. Yes, you really don't care.
No, you really don't care. So when I came to the States, the first time ever come to the States, and I was in a shoe store, and the lady said, how are you? It's like, she's so nice. And when I tried to answer, she was already gone. So she really didn't care. And but it's a common thing to do in the States. However, for me as a European, if you ask me, and then you do not care, that's worse than not asking. So you do something that's very typical for you in your culture, and everybody in your culture accepts and doesn't expect an answer or doesn't expect to stand there for 20 minutes. In my culture, that's not normal. And when it comes to men and women, it's the same thing. We grow up in our gender. We grow up a lot up, and expectations are set early on. I mean, look at a nursery. When you're expecting a baby, you're already planning what kind of colors you put in nursery, what kind of clothes you're going to buy. So early on, there are expectations linked to a gender, and then you behave not to fall out of line, and then later on, when you have a man in your life, you still expect to behave that certain way because you're taught that way, and then the cultures clash.
And then what happens?
Yeah, I mean, you grow up with male or female expectations, and then the hormones kick in. You're the expert on the hormones. The hormones kick in, and then you start chasing each other, and you have no idea what you signed up for. Then they don't act the way you want.
It's kind of like the dog that catches the bus and doesn't know then what to do with it. What do I do with this bus now? Well, what's your opinion, the biggest mistake in relationships between men and women? With these cultural differences, we're clearly sometimes not communicating very well. So what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see women make, really? Let's talk about women. We're talking about staying in our femininity.
Yeah, well, one of the biggest mistakes is that we expect the man to be a woman. There was this term called hairy women. We expect men to be hairy women, which means we want them to act and think and behave like a woman would. And they're not going to behave like that. And then we treat them like misbehaving kids. So he's not acting the way a woman would or my child would when I tell my child to do something. So I treat them as if they're misbehaving, and then we get frustrated, irritated, and that leads to then a gap in your relationship.
And then they get frustrated and irritated in the communication gap. Do you see that starting young?
Yes.
Like, do we tend to do that to our young boys, our sons?
Yes, yes, and I wish I could talk to the entire youth in the nation and teach them. I was at my oldest is in high school, and I was sitting at lunch the other day, and there was a boy sitting at our table, and he said, "Girls are so stupid." And I said, "No, they're not so stupid, they're just so different than what you do with your guys, and that's the problem, right? You don't understand them, and because you don't understand them, that's why you think they're stupid. They're not stupid, just different."
And just different, and the same thing as a mother raising a son, not treating them like a little girl is obviously very important, and you see that often, boys being, you know, demasculinized.
And especially if you had a girl, I had girls first, and then I had the boys, and there's a big difference in what you tell them, how to raise them, and if you make the mistake in trying to push them in that direction, then you're going to get frustrated with the boys faster than with the girls.
And it causes problems from the start. So, well, can you give us a common example of a misunderstanding between men and women?
Well, a common one that's funny is...
Just really briefly, actually, let's hold that, because I know we're going to go a little further on that one. That's a big question. So when we get back, we're going to talk a little bit more about miscommunication and misunderstanding between men and women. Stay with us.